I'm interested in what their image can represent in the context of my work. And so if I wasn't able to detach myself from them existing in the world as a person, I couldn't do that. And so I think as a painter, as an artist, there has to be an element of detachment from what you're doing, who you're using in your work, or what you're using in your work.
Welcome to the Flying Fruit Bowl, a platform dedicated to the discussion and exploration of art and the creative process. This episode is the second and final part of my conversation with artist Felicity Beaumont. Felicity is a UK-based artist who creates interesting abstract figures that recontextualise and reconsider the human form. Taking inspiration from media such as magazines and films, her work opens up discussions about the representation and objectification of the female body. I thoroughly enjoyed my conversation with Felicity, and I really hope you like it too. Yeah, I thought the first place to start would be the wine package you created, because it was actually really, really interesting, and the process was quite interesting as well. So do you want to just talk a bit about that?
Yeah, well, I do quite a bit of digital drawing, normally as more of sort of a process towards my painting. So I use the digital drawing as sort of like to mock up stuff I have an idea about and see if it'll actually work. But over lockdown, it's become more of like a bit more sort of a hobby side, a little bit like the embroidery started out with doing these sort of digital drawings that I haven't yet had time to transpose into paintings. And Orange Wine, who are a company based in London who do wine cases and wine subscription, and I love wine. So the company I'm aware of, and every month they do like a wine case, which you get the wines obviously, and then you also get like an art print, which they commission artists for, and then like a playlist included and like all extra stuff. So it's all like about creativity and wine and like putting the whole thing together. So they were looking for new designs for the next case of wine, and so they set the brief of a theme of rebirth, because obviously it's like spring and like coming into nature and stuff. And I wanted to obviously do a design to enter. And I sort of thought immediately of the Birth of Venus painting, and sort of the classical nude painting, that sort of style, and trying to reimagine it in a sort of more modern context, and obviously adhering to the brief with the sort of motifs of nature and wine. And then I used the butterfly design in the background as this sort of like spring and rebirth and sort of emerging into the world. So yeah, so I would have loved to do like a full-size painting for it, but given it was sort of like a few days to work on it, I thought I'd try to doing the digital drawing as sort of the final piece. So but yeah, but it's a really fun process. I sort of build it up on so I'll find like a reference image in a pose that I sort of like, and use that as like the main, just to build up composition. And then I'll sort of sketch out an outline of the figure from the reference image, just so I know where I'm going to place them. But then often, like with this one in particular, so the original pose was just a woman standing, but I wanted to have like the eating the grapes and the holding a glass of wine, sort of like posing. So I moved it around a bit, and then just sort of building up layers of color. It's a very similar process to with my paintings, but obviously done digitally. So there's less, I guess it's less organic and less fluid, and a bit more like paint by numbers almost, because I'm literally like, I'd love to make it all technical, but I just sort of in my mind isolating the areas of like tone and shade, as you do with like life drawing, and then building up in colors instead of in monochrome. So yeah.
That's really cool. That's really interesting. And it's also really interesting that it's digital as well. It's like a very different element to the work as opposed to your paintings and also your embroidery. That's quite nice. It's like you're very multifaceted. Like that's very interesting. And also it's just an interesting, contextualization of the nude, but also in a commercial setting, which actually is really, really interesting for your work and for like kind of the, to propel the idea of the body forward. Because at the end of the day, it's like, to some people it's taboo, but to other people it's liberating. And I think that's kind of I'm not saying like, the more we see news, the more accustomed we are to it.
Absolutely. And I think as well, the whole thing, like we were talking about before with the idea of context, if you think about going to like the National Gallery or something, you're going to see loads and loads of nude sculptures and paintings and everything. But you wouldn't expect to say go into like a supermarket and see a nude on a wine label or something like that. So I think there's a really interesting sort of opportunity there to use art but in a more like everyday context. Like I
Yeah,
love the idea of people just having like art on a vase that they have on their dinner table, not just in like a term of obviously like ceramic arts, but or there's so many things now where people are like making rugs of their paintings and stuff like that. And I love the idea of like
yeah,
living with art, not just on the walls, but like actually having it as a purpose as well. So then it comes, and it comes into packaging and everything as well, especially I think, like you say, in the digital age as well, there's so much more opportunity for, yeah, using like, I mean, you see it all the time with like classical paintings being put onto, packaging for stuff. But
yeah,
I think there's a real,
absolutely. Yeah. I actually
real
saw, the other day, I actually saw, and they followed me on Instagram, and I followed them back. And there's a skateboard company, and they had like 7 skateboards, and across it, they had a classical painting. It was so nice.
oh,
And it was
cool.
like really interesting, just a reimagination of the old into the new. I like that. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, and just like you say, sort of transpose it into something that's not only you want it to be like aesthetic, but also actually has a purpose.
Yeah,
Because so often I think people think of art as just like existing to be visual, whereas obviously it's so much more than that,
of course.
especially when you look at other mediums outside of like painting and photography and stuff. So yeah.
Absolutely. And why do you think it's is like actually a lot of alcohol brands that like to collaborate with artists? Because I'm thinking, because the last thing I thought of when you just said about wine in the supermarket, I thought of Absolute Vodka, and obviously they did a
I was
whole
just about to say that.
series, yeah,
Yeah.
of with artists. Like, why is it, do you think that alcohol brands, or like just like only a select kind of type of client would work with artists?
I think it probably comes a little bit back to what we were talking about last time about this sort of notion of art being not so much exclusive anymore, but like a luxury. And
Yeah.
so I think
Oh,
probably
yeah.
brands are looking at that sort of like connection between their brand being like a luxury brand and the
Yeah,
art
that's a good
being
point.
like
I
a
didn't think about that.
luxury.
It's a very good point. And that would
Yeah.
make sense as well.
Yeah, and you can see why they do it because obviously then they do like you say with the Absolute Vodka, and I think Tia Maria or someone like that did one a few years ago with like these limited edition. They only
Yeah,
made like,
so it becomes like collectible, like
yeah,
how
and so
art is.
yeah,
Yeah,
like a
that's
whole
cool.
other aspect to it. So you can totally see the link, but obviously then there comes the issue of, well, not the issue, but like the discussion around the like commercialization of the arts and whether people are, if they're being original with their work, if they're working to a brief and to a brand or something like that. So it's a huge discussion to have, but I do think it's definitely like a positive of a way of like integrating the arts into people's lives in ways they wouldn't really expect. Like you say, especially with like alcohol in particular, like I say, I see it as like a luxury or a treat. And so making it something that's also like aesthetic without, I don't know, then is it like glamorizing alcohol? I don't know. Anyway, that's a whole other
Yeah,
conversation
but
to
I say
have.
that is a whole other conversation. That's definitely not something we're going to approach here. But I think the idea of art and advertising is extremely interesting, and I feel like as the years go on, it becomes more like they become very much integrated. And I think,
Yeah.
do you think that there could be a problem where we get to a point where we're bombarded so much by art and advertising that it's hard to distinguish the two?
Um, Very interesting question. I think we could definitely get a point at which the advertising becomes like so highly saturated with artistic imagery that it's not as effective. But I think there'll always be quite a distinction between whatever you want to call fine arts,
Yeah.
like that sort of category, and art with function. A bit like there's a sort of distinction between fine art and like design in terms of its intended purpose. I think there'll always be a you'll always be able to separate the two with like the type of art you'd go see in a gallery. But I think it's probably also down to a little bit of like historical context as well. Like artists that are creating now, I'm seeing so many more. I can't remember her name. Amber Vittoria does loads of the like again we're talking about alcohol, but beer can sleeves like paintings and
Oh,
do like I
okay.
say like a real limited edition run, and so they're really exclusive and everyone so there's a whole thing with obviously with for the artist as well. It's almost like branching out into a different medium,
Yeah.
but then making it functional too. So I think as long as it stays true to like the artist's nature, I don't think anyone who's making work that's going to be used in marketing is going to become just like a marketing artist.
Yeah.
But I think it'll depend on how much it's used as to whether we just become like, oh, another painting in an advert, another, nice looking wine bottle, and we just don't care anymore. And then I don't know if there'll be a movement to like, oh my god, that artist is still exhibiting in a gallery. How like cool and original. But yeah, I think it's very interesting. It'll be really interesting to see how much of a crossover there is with stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's definitely interesting. I think it's interesting because people are becoming more innovative as the years go by, particularly with like digital, particularly like the digital area and like virtual reality and augmented reality. And that's like a whole nother kind of area of exploration for, I think, definitely the arts itself. I think the whole virtual reality galleries that we're seeing at the minute, they're interesting, but but anyway, forgetting all that, let's get on to your actual work because, that's what we're here to discuss. So I actually thought I would love to focus a little bit more on your paintings because when I listened to the last interview, we spoke about them, we touched upon them, but not as much as I would necessarily have liked to.
Okay.
I say that now, but we'll probably just go back into your embroidery as well because why not?
Because it's got
So,
to, maybe.
and because because like, all your work is very cyclical, it feeds back into itself. It's very similar. So the first thing I wanted to ask you, or at least talk about, is your use of color because I think that's something that we didn't talk about. And I looked through your work again. I was like, why did we not talk about that? So let's talk about use of color. So what kind of colors do you gravitate towards, and how do you kind of decide what kind of color palette you're going to have when you create an image?
Oh, good question. It varies on the piece I'm doing. Sometimes, like I was just mentioning there with the digital drawing, I will take an image before I even start considering it as a painting and just play around with it, even just on Photoshop. Like, I'll just go nuts, like you did when you were a kid, just like upping the saturation to ridiculous levels and playing around with the filters and stuff. Um, and just seeing if anything interesting jumps out at me. So sometimes it's sort of an approach of I'll just amplify all of the colors that are already there in the image and then like sort of exaggerate it if the image has particularly got some nice tones to it already. But most of the time it's quite an organic process where it'll come to me as I'm painting. I usually start out with sort of like a base wash on my painting. So I'll have an idea of the kind of palette I'm looking at. And I very much work in not to compare myself to Picasso or anything, but I very much have like a phase of color. So at the moment I'm like crazy into greens.
Okay.
So anytime I start painting I'm like, right, green background. um so it's often like a starting point for the palette is the sort of mood I'm in at the time. So like a lot of my work when I was studying, I was in very like blues and purples and that sort of feel to them. Um, but it's quite organic in how it works. Um, my most recent pieces, I would say, are some of the more sort of have the widest palette and are very much like really different colors. But I have some of the initial pieces I did, my first piece, let's say when I was studying, like that were in this style, were very much like, okay, this is going to be, well, this is a really good example actually. This is a print of mine. So
Aha.
it was all like reds and pinks and sort of warm tones. So a lot of my paintings, I would choose like a tone category and start there, and then it would just be a case of building up the layers like that. But I think recently I've become much more experimental with just sort of seeing what works. I wish that was a more satisfying answer of like it
No,
has meaning, like, thing, but
no,
most of the time,
that's a good answer. But like, do you think? But you said that you think about tone, so there is some kind of meaning to it, and obviously, color is extremely meaningful. To as much to the degree which you prefer it to be, because I think some people can look at an image and be like, "Oh, it's red," but other people can be like, "Oh, it means passion or it means something." And
yeah.
I think like you don't have to necessarily be aware of that. You don't necessarily have to use color in that way. But I think it's interesting that you kind of almost can't avoid your work being interpreted in some way due to the color. And
Mm,
your use of color is very, very fascinating because it's very obviously it's like in blocks and in kind of in contrast to one another. And I think it makes a whole you have to look at it to decipher the image. And I think that's what's really interesting about your work. Because as you can imagine, I looked again through your website and again through your blog. Um, and I was just thinking like it's really interesting because your work is very abstract, but it's also very obvious what it is, but at the same time it's not obvious what it is. And like can you just talk a bit about that in terms of like, are you trying to tell the viewer what to look at, or are you trying to make your work more ambiguous?
oh, that's difficult to answer. I mean, first of all, it's great that you say that because I think that's exactly what I'm going for with the paintings. Like when people ask me to describe my work, people who haven't seen it before, I find it really difficult to say because I sort of say, "Oh, I'm a figurative painter, but abstract," and they're like, "What?" Like that doesn't, which it doesn't really at all when you think about it. But I guess it is that thing of ambiguity. It's like I'm interested in the figure, but I paint it in an abstract or ambiguous way. And I think I like the idea of people spending more than like a fleeting look with a painting. And so having that ambiguity of needing to sort of go, oh, okay, it's that. It it builds more of a relationship with the painting as the viewer than if you immediately tell what a painting is, I think that you almost miss a little bit of the deciphering of what the artist was trying to achieve in the middle. Not necessarily in all cases, but I think with my work, I think you'd lose a little bit of the sort of the context and the dialogue around my work. If it was just nude figurative art, I think it would be more about purely the aesthetic rather than the ideas like we talked about before about context, about viewership, about like sort of the reclaiming of the gaze and that sort of thing, and like the idea of looking and whether you should be or not, I think, which is so important to me with my work, that I think if I was just painting the figure, potentially that wouldn't translate for the viewer. So I think by making it ambiguous, using unusual colors and tones or non-traditional colors and tones, I think it makes you spend more time with the work, which then I hope creates some form of dialogue within the viewer that they think, oh, well, why have they done it like that then?
Yeah.
And then they start to consider the connotations of the painted nude, of the figure, of the body, of the female body, all these sort of facets of my work. Um, so yeah, I guess it is that sort of thing of wanting to be a little bit abstract to make the viewer sort of stop and think rather than just going, yep, that's another portrait of a woman. Yep, that's another portrait of that, you know. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question at all.
No, it does. Yeah. So it's like kind of really is to hold the attention of the viewer and to
Yeah,
get them, it's to engage them more with your work, which I think obviously it does a very good job because I really like your work and it's really interesting. And it does do that because you can spend 10 minutes looking at an image and be like, what is that? And then you kind of decipher it and you have to be like, oh, okay. And also,
yeah.
one of the things that really kind of both confuses the images, the titles. Your titles are really interesting. Actually, wait, I have some written down here. Yeah, so that's it. So some of your titles are submerged mirror, bicycle, with rose. How do you come up with the titles, and does the idea for the titles come before or after the image is completed?
The idea for the title usually is something to do with the image. So when I first started out doing this sort of style of painting, I was working a lot with images from social media. And so I would always use part of the caption from that image as the
Oh,
title.
okay, that's a cool
Um,
idea.
yeah, so I think it was sort of trying to, again, address this notion of context and, you know, seeing um, how the image I saw then related to what the original or the person in the image or whoever posted the image had thought when they saw the image. So a lot of I think there's one that comes to mind is Sunshine, and there's one called Dark Days, and they're both to do with the Instagram captions. The ones you've mentioned there are with Rose is one of the a series I did from classical paintings, done in sort of my style and zoomed in. So that was from the title of the original painting. It's called something like it's a woman's name, like on bed with Rose or something like that. Like so, I called it with Rose. Um, Bicycle and Submerged Mirror are from the series I did using pornographic imagery. So that was more to do with like what was physically in the original image.
Oh,
Um, so the submerged mirror ones, so there's like four small versions of those. So they're all different fragments of this pose, which is a woman lying in a pool, but then there's a mirror underneath her. So like the
oh,
reflection of the water is on her as well. Um, so that's where that title came from. And bicycle, I think there's literally just like a bicycle in that shot.
yeah, because they were really
So
fascinating. I was going through and I was thinking, like, did you name them to throw the viewer off or to kind of give the viewer some kind of clue? Because to me, I
well,
was like, they seem really random, but there has to be a reason you titled them that.
that's what a lot of people ask. They say, "Do you just come up with random words?" And it's never random. It's always either because of something in the image or because of the way the image is captioned or titled or something to do with that. But I liked the idea that, similarly to what we were just saying about like the color and the ambiguity, having a title that didn't help the viewer
Yes.
know what the image was, again adds some, like you say, it makes someone think, well, why is it called bicycle if there's not it's not a painting of a bicycle. So I think it's just again sort of me encouraging more interaction with the work, and more thought on it without, like, I didn't want to prescribe to the viewer what they were supposed to think. I didn't want to, show them the image and then go, from page 2 of um, this edition of Playboy this year and this cropped. I didn't want to say
Yeah, of
that.
course.
So I think I wanted to make it again just another layer of ambiguity and another layer of sort of encouraging reflection on what they're looking at. So yeah, so they're never random. They always do have a meaning, even some of the really random ones. Um, but they're always related in some way. But often people say to me, "Well, why didn't you call it that?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, that probably would have been better."
That's push didn't think of it at the time. I think titles
Yeah.
are really, really interesting though, because they're just, it's just fascinating because it's like it gives your work like a finality. It's like it's done, it has a title. But did you think
Mm.
about the title? So the title's come before or after,
Um,
or during potentially?
yeah, I don't think ever before. I think either during or after. Um, I think probably while I was, especially with the ones from social media with the captions, I think while I was painting, I was probably thinking, oh, what was that caption again? Like it said something about that, maybe that'll work. And then once I got to the point at which it was finished, I sort of thought, oh, okay, yeah, that does work, or oh no, that doesn't work. So yeah, I think towards the end of the process is where the name comes about. But a lot of the time, I find myself, like you've just said, wondering about, is there any point in even naming them? Because it is such a, unless your work is really conceptual, I think titles are a very odd concept for figurative works. Um, but then again, it does lend something to the sort of nature of the piece and what you're trying to say. And also, obviously, a lot of the time, titles are almost used to tell you what the piece is about when it is a very abstract or modernist work where, there's not much visually to tell you. Whereas I think my works are quite visually informative. So the titles are probably less important than other artists' work, where I think the titles are quite key to the substance of the piece. So yeah, um, but no, it's definitely like a towards the end of the process. Sorry, I've just
Yeah,
sort of
because
most long-winded, so I've answered that.
no, that's fine. I think for me, I always think titles are a good way of knowing what piece of work people like, and if they ever wanted prints, you can actually figure out which ones they like. Because I
Yeah,
think that the thing is that if you have all your work is entitled, and somebody wants to say a print, and they're like, "Oh, I want entitled number 5," you're going to be like, "Which one's that?"
yeah,
So
totally.
at least with the title, you're like, "Okay, that's cool. I know exactly which image you want. Here you go." It makes the cataloging process of your work easier.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing is it almost comes down to more of um a functional thing. Like we just said there, the fact that you can name pieces and I can go, oh, yeah, I know that what that one is, rather than you going, oh, that one that's like dark blue and then it's got the weird bit along the bottom and there's like a streak of white and me trying to be like, what? It's
You're
easy
like,
to say, oh, I really like that painting, or oh, tell me about that painting. So yeah, they definitely have a functionality as well.
so you use yourself in your work sometimes, right?
Yeah, sometimes I hadn't for a really long time. And then in the first lockdown, I did some self portraits. Yeah.
So how has that experience been, and how do you think that affects the kind of reading of your work?
Um, Good question. It was a very different experience for me painting images of myself. I think because of the familiarity, obviously with the subject, when I'm using images or images of people that I don't know or aren't very familiar with, I'm obviously it's more of a visual process where I'm looking and I'm seeing, oh, okay, the hip bone is there, oh, the shoulder is there. And it's probably more accurate. Whereas with myself, I was very aware when painting myself of being like, oh, I didn't think my rib cage was that sort of angle, or oh, my arm looks longer than that. Like I was very much not like nitpicking my body, but almost nitpicking my eyes and thinking, am I seeing that wrong? Like that picture doesn't add up. So it was quite difficult for me to be really strict with, I had to almost detach myself from knowing it was me and just purely look at the form and go from there rather than feeling like it was a self portrait.
Yeah,
It's really difficult, and I think that's why they're quite different to some of my other works. I would say, the painting style is much less the sort of blocks of color that we were talking about before, and was much more like figurative. Sorry, expressive. Um, and sort of, I don't know, it felt almost like cathartic in a weird way of, let's say, experiencing the being the painter and being the subject, and also being the viewer. Like, it was a whole process, but it was really, I really enjoyed it. It was really interesting, and I think I'm really happy with the work. I think that I'm really proud of them. I think they're really good. um but I was definitely very aware that I was painting myself, and it made it more difficult to be aware of anything else that I'm normally thinking of when I'm painting. So yeah, they were very different, but very interesting.
Would you do it again?
Yeah, I think so. But I'd probably do like an isolated series of self-portraits and keep it separate, because I just think it's so hard to, which comes back to the whole thing we were talking about with like beauty and everything last week, or whatever it was last time. Um, the whole like sort of judgment, and it was quite hard to be sort of separate and distance from my own self. So yeah, I think I'd definitely do it again, and I'd love to do an embroidery similar to the paintings that I did, um, which I'm hoping to do soon. But I think similarly the embroideries would be really different to my other embroideries. I think there's something about self portraits. They're just so particular, and I think I'm obsessed with self portraits. I think they're so
Yeah, about to
interesting.
say, actually, that's what I was going just about to ask you. The next question was, what actually is your opinion on self portraits in art? Because obviously, it kind of goes two ways. It's very like insular and very kind of reflective of the artist, but then it could also be seen very egotistical.
Mm.
So, what's your opinion on them? Do you think that there's a place for them? Do you think that more people should do it?
I think there's definitely a place for them. I find them absolutely fascinating. But then I think potentially what I find fascinating is the notion of like looking at oneself. Um, but no, I think they're really interesting in the way, like we were just saying about how we see other people as to how we see ourselves is so totally different. And so when you're looking at a self-portrait of an artist compared to some of their other works, often there's a real difference, not necessarily in the style, but in either like the accuracy almost of the image, especially if you see a painting of somebody, a famous artist that you think you know what they look like, and then they've done something completely odd. But also, I think you see the really conceptual self portraits, like, oh, I can't remember who it is, but someone's self portrait is just like a pair of shoes.
Yeah,
Um, and also, so you get into the whole idea of like identity, and personality and stuff as well. So I think they're definitely interesting, and there's definitely a place for them. But I'd love to see like the National Self Portrait Gallery and just have that, and just have all the
yeah,
self portraits
that's an
together.
interesting idea.
I think that'd be awesome. I like I say, I love looking at artist self portraits. I think it's fascinating. Um, but I do think there's a very different context behind self portraiture than there is behind, especially figurative painting. I think it's a whole different avenue of work, just in terms of like the thinking behind it.
That's for sure. That's a good answer, I must say, because I think you're right, and I just think it's really fascinating because you're right. The way that we look at ourselves and the idea of the self, I think that's super interesting. So now I'm always interested in them. So when I was going through your blog, actually the first time around, because this was from your original interview notes. So the one thing that was really, really interesting in your work that I kind of got a sense from is the idea of detachment. And I put here detachment from real life to pixels on a screen to paint on a canvas. And I think that's really interesting because and it's something that I didn't even think about until I read your blog. And it's this idea of the process of detachment, both the way that art does it and the screen does it, and also the way that we are also detached from real life, from other people's lives. Can you talk a bit about that in terms of like, do you think that art is a good medium for detachment, and why is that so important?
Yeah, it's definitely like a big, like you said, a key theme in my work, and especially the early works when I was sort of establishing my style. Like we just talked about with the self portraits, there, I think in order to create any art, I think there has to be a level of detachment, because when you're creating, when I'm painting, you're thinking about the paint, you're thinking about the subject, and you're thinking about this person, but it's focused on a different element of it. Um, and especially with the digital, because the digital image is such a snapshot. If I'm scrolling on Instagram and I see a picture of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of someone famous, David Beckham. Um, I look at that image and I know it's David Beckham, but I'm not thinking like about David Beckham at his house right now having lunch with his kids or something. I'm
Yeah.
thinking that is an image of David Beckham. And it's a total detachment between like a person and an image of a person, especially with celebrity and especially with social media. I think there's so much removal of like, not responsibility. I guess it is a kind of responsibility. Like you think about trolling and stuff like that. There's so much movement away from real life when you're on social media. It just feels like the other people don't exist. You feel like you're playing a game and you're the only
Yeah.
real player. Obviously on a very like subconscious level.
Yes.
And I think with the digital image, that's the same thing. Like I say, because it's such a snapshot, because it's such an instantaneous thing, we're only thinking when we view that about that instantaneous image. And we're not thinking about the subject necessarily unless there's almost a relationship between them. Like especially thinking about the work with the pornography. When you look at, you know, a Playboy shoot or something, I doubt anyone looks at them and goes, oh, like I wonder what that woman had for breakfast, or I wonder what her hobbies are, or what her favorite colors. That it's purely visual, and it is purely that looking for visual pleasure, and it's all about the aesthetic. It's all about beauty. It's all about like the currency of the aesthetic, and it's so detached from if you were to see that same woman like at the beach, you'd probably still think beautiful person, but you wouldn't like objectify them in the same way, I would think, as if they're in an image, because it's like you say, it's the detachment of not being a real person, it being an image of a person. And I think the same thing happens with art, is that it's like that quote I said last week, which I said I was going to look up and send you who it was, and I didn't do that, so I will do that. But that thing about art making everything an object, it's so true.
Yes. Absolutely.
Even with hyper realistic paintings, you know it's a painting, and so you're aware it's a painting, and so in your head you're detached from the fact that it's not physically a person in the same way that I think a photograph is more physically a person. But then depending on the context of a photograph, let's say on social media, everyone's just other weird players in this odd game that we're obsessed with. Like it's a whole head fuck, really. I don't really know how to describe it,
Yeah,
but yeah.
no, yeah, like people are just pixels on a screen. And it's like
Yeah,
it's hard to realize that when you're caught up in it. And
absolutely.
it's weird to think of it like that as well.
Yeah, and especially with the amount of like editing, not just in terms of the image, but like the curation of Instagram in particular, like the
Yeah.
whole idea of like a snapshot of someone's life and thinking that's reality and being told it's reality when, you know, we have no idea. And so there is that whole detachment of basically you're being told something that you're expected to believe is true, but also you judge it on whether you're not, you do perceive it to be true. I don't think I'd be able to want to discuss context and objectification and viewership and looking if I wasn't able to detach myself from the individual I'm painting, because by painting them and wanting to discuss all those things, I am almost disregarding that they have their own life and personality and attitude and all this sort of stuff. And that's not what I'm interested in at that point. I'm interested in what their image can represent in the context of my work. And so if I wasn't able to detach myself from them existing in the world as a person, I couldn't do that. And so I think as a painter, as an artist, there has to be an element of detachment from what you're doing, or who you're using in your work, or what you're using in your work. But I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, um, in the sense of art. Whereas when it comes to imagery and objectification and digital imagery, it can obviously be damaging because we start to associate images of people as being objects, as being disposable. And you obviously remove the fact that that is a real person, let's say, especially when it comes to online and you look at trolling and all this sort of stuff. So yeah, I think there's an answer somewhere in there. I hope you can find it.
No, that actually the very much is. Like I think that it's a really interesting conversation to have, especially with you because you were the one who raised it in the first place. But it's a really interesting conversation to have because I think art nowadays, at least, we look at a lot of art on screen. No, I always ask people if that knowing their work is going to be viewed online changes the way they create the work.
You know, when you're stood in a gallery and it's all someone's own work, there's this sort of, you're immersed in it and you can link between pieces, and there's sort of the whole atmosphere of being in a physical exhibition. Whereas when you're viewing work online and it is just like, right, JPEG scroll, JPEG scroll, knowing that a work's going to be viewed individually, I think makes me more aware of whether or not that piece alone is saying what I want it to say, and like a whole thought process and all of my work just being a representation of those ideas and those discussions. Knowing that work's going to be viewed online, I think I'm then very specific, like, oh, okay, is this painting saying what I think it's saying? Is this painting good enough to be viewed as a standalone painting and still have the gravitas I want it to? And I don't know if there's an answer for that. I think it's just something you're more aware of when you know your work's going to be viewed digitally. You're more aware of thinking, of sort of not having to justify it, but maybe being prepared to need to explain it more. Which again is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think there's definitely a difference between viewing work digitally and viewing work in person. And I think that is true even of digital work. Like it's so brilliant, especially because of lockdown, that there are so many amazing like video artists and audio artists and stuff like that that you can view online. But there's definitely a different experience to sitting in your living room watching a brilliant piece of video art as to sitting in a dark gallery surrounded by other people watching it. So I think there's definitely a difference, but I don't know if it affects too much the way I actually create work, probably just more the way and the like the excitement of putting work up in a gallery is very different to the excitement of like
Of course.
a new piece on my website. Not just because I think it's obviously not as like it's not viewed as like a big thing, but also I'm more aware that it's more accessible, and potentially because of what we just talked about with detachment of being online. Luckily, not that I've had any of this experience, but people could email me and be like, your work is crap. Like they literally could. They could just email me and be like, I hated everything here. Whereas I don't feel like people would do that in a gallery. So there's definitely that sort of awareness that it's very accessible and you're very much just a name on a screen rather than seeing this painting being like, wow, someone spent a really long time on this and like appreciating it.
Yeah, but so do you think that social media and kind of just the size of phones and stuff does justice for art and artists and their work?
No, absolutely not. I think you can get a real appreciation for a piece and you can really love a piece of art from seeing it on your phone and seeing it in your hand and seeing it that small. And you can think, wow, that's really impressive. But I don't think anything compares to being stood in front of a painting and being like, wow. And it's something about the sort of presence of it in a room as well. Which I
Yeah,
think is why I think we spoke about this briefly last time. We said about the virtual reality exhibitions. I think they're great, but I think in the same way that the Kindle will never replace the physical book,
yeah.
I
I have
think
a book right next to it. Yeah, I agree completely.
yeah, I think galleries will always exist. I think there will be more exhibitions online, and it's actually got everything in it rather than just a few pieces to sort of encourage you to go to gallery. But I don't think people will ever stop going to see art in person because I think it is so much about experience and physically being with a piece of work as well. So yeah, and I think that's just the sort of natural evolution of stuff. In terms of especially with current like the digital media we have, there's so much we can view online and on our phones, but like I would never choose to not see a piece of artwork in person. I would always
Of
want to
course.
see it physically. Um, but yeah, I
But I
think
say,
again, sorry.
no, continue, sorry, continue.
I was gonna say I think that comes back again to what we were talking about earlier with like the way of integrating art into people's lives. Being able to view a exhibition on your phone from the comfort of your sofa, it removes that sort of exclusivity of thinking that the galleries are like not accessible to the general public, even though they are. But that
Yeah,
whole notion that we were talking about before. And I think obviously then thinking if you don't feel like you're the type of person that would go to a gallery, but you really love Turner, you could look at
cool,
all his
good call.
paintings on your phone. Which I feel like that's not a category of people because surely everyone who loves Turner goes to see Turner. But you know, it's that sort of thing of, oh, if you're not comfortable going to the exhibition, but you want to see it, you could. So I think there's the positive in that, but I think the physical experience of artwork will always trump digital.
That's cool. I agree with that completely. One thing that I'd be very silly not to talk about, and you probably spoke about this plenty of times, you're probably sick of it, but the male gaze.
Mm,
So how obviously that's going to have some impact on your work, and obviously you're aware of it. I'm assuming you are.
of
I'd be
course, yeah.
surprised if you weren't. So can you just talk a bit about like how much does that influence your work, and how much thought of the viewer do you put into your work whilst you're creating it?
I think the thing with the male gaze is, especially as a woman, you're so aware of it in your entire life without necessarily consciously being aware of it, that it's impossible not to constantly think about it. I think about the male gaze 20 out of 24 hours of the day without wanting to. And I almost partly hate that I do, because
Yeah,
it's so mental, but I think it's so ingrained in society. Um, and just that sort of the gender dynamic is what's so ingrained. Like, it's impossible not to consider it, especially in the work I do, but in just being a female, it's like so relevant to everything. I mean, perfect example, we're doing an audio interview, and my immediate thought before this was, should I put on makeup? And it's just like, I haven't put on makeup in like 6 months. Every time I do a Zoom with anybody,
oh,
I'm
it's so
like,
funny.
I know, but this is the thing. And it's so much about the idea of presenting yourself as a woman and being attractive to
Yeah,
anyone, to men, but also to other women, to be
of
like,
course.
y- your value is placed on your aesthetic. And so I'm constantly thinking about it. But when it comes to painting, I think I'm thinking about it more in terms of the idea of viewership, and the idea of it almost becoming like a judgment of everybody. So the fact that I'm really butchering how I'm saying this,
That's
that
fine.
the idea that I know that the male gaze influences everybody, either on a conscious or a subconscious level, means that I know all the images I'm looking at have been influenced in their creation by the male gaze, but also in the way I've presented them. And I know a lot of artists, and a lot of artists speak about trying to like reclaim the gaze. Just I don't think that's possible. I don't think there's any way that you can turn around, you can like flip a socially ingrained construct. There's no way you can just take that away. We can improve upon it, and we can remove the aspect of them of that sort of misogynistic viewpoint that is about objectification and ownership. But I think there's always going to be this thing about the visual and the visual judgments, and also the being looked at and versus looking. Um, and I think in my paintings, dear more, and then you're suddenly aware, oh, I'm looking at a nude body. And then there's almost like this moment where you're like, oh, I've spent way too long looking at this. Am I going to look like a perv? And it's like, yeah, but it's like a comment on wider society of, yeah, but don't you spend all day looking at other people and judging them? And I think it then feeds into the notion of the female gaze as well. Women are looking at other women and judging them on their beauty in the standard that's set by the male gaze. So all subconsciously, all because of various things. But yeah, I think it's impossible not to think about it when I'm creating my work. But I almost think that's a good thing, because I think that it's an important concept behind my work as well. Like, I want that to be one of the discussion points. But yeah, I just hope that people don't think I'm trying to like reclaim it or reverse it, because I don't think that's a possibility. I think it's something that is so you're so aware of if you're on the receiving end of it.
Yeah,
Like, as a
yeah,
woman or as a minority, you're so aware of constantly being sort of viewed. Um, Whereas for the majority of males, it's something that you would have to read about.
oh,
Like,
absolutely.
if I said to my brothers, well, yeah, that's true though. I think if I said to one of my brothers, "Oh, what do you think about the male gaze?" They'd be like, "The what?" Or I think if I
Exactly.
said to any woman, even if they had never read The Beauty Myth or anything like that and had no sort of theoretical understanding of it, I think if I said the male gaze, most women would be like, "Oh yeah, I know what that is."
Yeah.
And I think that's the whole point, is it just comes back to the idea of viewership and the being watched and being looked at, and whether you're aware of yourself being looked at or whether you're aware of yourself looking. And I hope that my paintings will make anyone who looks at them aware that they're looking at someone and not just at a painting, if that makes sense.
Yes, that does, and your answer is very nice. I like your answer. I think it's yeah, it's a very good answer, and I'm glad I asked you because I feel like for some reason I listened to the last interview and I was like, how do I not bring that up? That's like it
I
was like
swear.
obviously it's in my notes, and I felt kind of like should I bring it up because it's you probably get asked that a lot and you're probably sick of it. But then again, I guess it's an important topic of discussion.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, I do talk about it a lot, and I do get asked about it a lot, but it's not something I ever get tired of because I think it's a relevant conversation to have. Um, but I'm also very aware of trying not to come across too angry feminist in my answers.
I
'Cause a
mean,
lot
that's the thing,
of
like as a male, like it's not something you're right. It's not something I really think about. It's not something that obviously kind of I was gonna say defines the things I do, whereas then maybe it'll be a very different experience for you. And actually it's quite interesting for me to hear it from obviously the opposite perspective. So thank you very much. I appreciate that a lot.
welcome.
So eroticism and empowerment, is there a fine line between the two?
Um, I think that's definitely a line, but I think it's probably a squiggly line. Because I think
It's a
that's a
great
technical
answer.
term. You can use that. Um, I think it's so individual because I think for some people, like posting nude photos of himself online or posing for life drawing or something and being like nude and looked at and viewed is super empowering. And for other people, it would be uncomfortable and they would feel sexualized and all the so I think it's such a personal thing, and I think that's what the thing with movements like free the nipple and the whole thing I think we talked about last week
Yeah.
with Instagram censoring on certain body types and all this sort of thing. The whole point is it's not about saying free the nipple so that women can all women should walk around topless or something like that. It's about saying stop policing bodies.
Yeah.
So, and it's about saying people can use their bodies in whichever way they see fit, and you shouldn't be able to define it for them what it is. So if I were to post a selfie on my Instagram, posing nude for a painting and said like super empowering to be able to model for such and such an artist, and then someone was like, oh, this is basically porn, like blah, 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 that's the flip side of it. Whereas if I was sending a photo to my boyfriend posing nude, it's a whole different intention. I would want him to that would be intended to be viewed erotically. So I think there's a whole tangent that comes in from who it is, but also from what it's intended to be. And it's just the whole idea that it should be down to the individual as to what their body and them as a person and everything is viewed as and is seen as, rather than it being any naked body is sexualized. Or empowerment doesn't just mean running around in your underwear at any size. Empowerment can mean wearing a burqa. Empowerment can mean wearing super baggy clothes so no one knows what your body looks like. It's totally individual. I mean, like Billie Eilish, the singer, had so
Yeah.
much backlash because she wears baggy clothing. She's like, I want to wear baggy clothing. I'm like, oh, are you trying to cover up your body? She's like,
Not just that,
well,
she's a teenager at the end of the day.
yeah, not only that,
That
exactly.
makes it
And
weirder. That makes it so weird that people are like, oh no, they want to see what's underneath. Like she's a teenager, leave her alone.
exactly, it's ridiculous. And also the whole thing of, well, that's her level of empowerment. That's her saying, I don't need to strut around the stage in skimpy clothing to be a good pop star. Whereas other pop stars, like Katy Perry, for example, that's her empowerment. She's like, no, I'm going to own my body by wearing skimpy clothing. So it's this whole thing of, like I say, it's who's doing it and why they're doing it, and the fact that people shouldn't be commenting on it for other purposes. If someone says they're empowered by running around in their underwear, it is not up to another person to say, I wouldn't find that empowering. I'd find that really sexual, because that's fine. Don't do it then, And I think that's the
Yeah.
whole thing with eroticism and empowerment and the nude body is it's often put in one category or the other. And the thing is, it shouldn't be. It should be the owner of that body can say what their body is and can do whatever they want with it. And that's where I think that links back into the male gaze as well. Like, you see so many people, especially on Instagram. Again, we keep coming back to this. But like, yeah, influencers posing in a bikini, saying about, oh, like I love my body and I feel really empowered, not covering up and being able to wear a swimsuit on the beach, even though I'm, plus size, whatever else. And then people are like, men commenting, "This is so sexy," blah, 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 and you're like, they've just said this is empowering for them because they're not being sexualized.
Yeah,
Just leave it, but that comes back to
yeah,
the whole Instagram thing.
yeah. Not everything is about being sexual. And I
Yeah,
think
but then
people don't
on some
realize
on
that.
the flip side, obviously some things intentionally are, and I think the whole notion of the line between empowerment and the erotic is the intention of the subject of that image or that action, um, and what they intend it to do. And if someone's saying, "I'm doing this for empowerment," and you think it's erotic, then zip your lip.
No,
I think.
that's an absolute great answer. Thank you very much. I think it's a great answer, and I'm actually glad to ask you that question because I wasn't sure if I should ask you that. I was but I'm glad I did. That's cool. So
You can ask anything. I'm an open book. I will get a bit feminist ranty on something, so
no,
just
that's fine. Like, that's fine. But I think okay. So there's a question I want to ask you. Let me quickly type it
yeah.
because I'll forget it. But whilst I'm doing this, I'll ask you this other question: Is that do you think there's a difference between the terms naked and the nude?
Um, I think a similar thing to the erotic versus empowered, it's a lot to do with intention. I personally feel like naked suggests the absence of something, which obviously, in a sort of logical sense, it suggests the absence of clothes. But for me, I prefer to term my works nude paintings because it's more thinking about like what is there. So someone is there and nude. They're not without clothing in the sense that they are bare without. I don't know what that's garbage. um, what do I mean? I think naked feels sort of like I don't know, almost like accusatory or like a bad thing, whereas nude feels like elegant and artistic. And I think I don't know. I'm really thinking about that now. I've not really thought about this properly before. I think that nude implies like intentionally being without clothes, whereas naked implies almost like, oh, like I don't know, something a bit to this is you probably don't want to put this in. Let me think about
We'll
this
come
in
back
the
to it. We'll come back to the question if you like.
yeah, I'll think on that and maybe I'll be like,
Okay.
oh, ask me that question again.
Oh, well, yeah. Remind me. So, okay. So the question that I wanted to ask you that I would have forgot is: So, do you think that as a female creating images of females, your work is more heavily criticized because you are a female creating images of female?
I think there's definitely an element of um, potential criticism from people not people not fully aware of what I'm trying to do. Like I've had a lot of people, not a lot of people, a few people, in my lifetime be like, "Oh, are you like a closet lesbian then?" What? Are you what? I think there's definitely a lot of like judgment or perception about women painting other women, which is mad because when you think about the amount of men that are painting other men and no one bats an eyelid. But I think it's because it comes back to this whole thing about the male gaze is society finds it unsettling when a woman is taking hold of viewing another woman and presenting it through a gaze that is um, accustomed to the male gaze, if that makes sense. So there's almost like a defense mechanism of going, sorry, are you looking at women? No, they're for men. So, and again, I think it's people who are not aware of the sort of level of
Yeah.
art that I'm talking about. Um, but yeah, I think there's definitely a not a stigma, but probably an expectation and probably some prejudgment in the type of person that I am, maybe because of the subject matter I'm working with and because of my gender. Um, but I also think there's sometimes I think that's a good thing because I think it reinforces the discussion I'm trying to have because I think my work would be very different if I was a man and it would be perceived very differently, even
Of
if I
course.
had completely the same attitude, obviously, because of having a lived experience as a woman, that influences my work in a way that I don't think I
Of
would have if
course.
I was male. Um, so yeah, I don't think it necessarily becomes criticism from people who know what they're talking about. But I think there's definitely an element of my gender being a factor in my work, but I think in a good way.
Yeah, and I asked that question because there is a photography account that I follow called Boys by Girls. And what it is that it's women photographers shooting images of men. Because
Okay.
obviously photography is very male dominated.
Yeah.
And it's, it's a really interesting account. I haven't looked at it for a long time, but and I just thought of this kind of, I guess, as you said, really, like kind of the gender dynamics of what's expected that people like to see based upon their gender. And I think,
Yeah.
yeah, I was just wondering, like, as someone who obviously looks at a lot of art, and I see a lot of artists painting a lot of nudes and a lot of artists painting, men painting men, women painting women. It's just an interesting question to ask because, like, there's a painter I really like. Her name's Jane Clatworthy. I'll send you her link because her work's really nice, and she paints male nudes, and it's just really interesting because it's very different,
Mm,
and it's very interesting. And her idea and her stance of the gaze is very, very interesting. It's and she's from London, so actually that'd be really good to send to you,
yeah, sounds
because
fascinating.
maybe we'll want to talk. I don't know. I like making connections randomly, but yeah,
Please
her
do.
work's really interesting, and it's actually quite. I'd say in a way like it's opposite to yours. It's quite interesting, and actually it'd be really nice to see your work next week. So that'd be really interesting. Or to see you two have a discussion about the gaze. That would be really interesting. I should set that up. That'd be so good.
Please do. Even the fact that she's painting male nudes, like when you say nude painting and figurative painting, everyone instantly thinks of women
Yes,
because I think again it's that sort of traditional nude paintings were like, the sort of pre-Raphaelite style.
absolutely. Yeah, Birth of Venus. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. And other than like David and basically doing like statues of guys for um almost like boasting purposes, like the bust of Caesar and that sort of thing. It was all about like for aesthetic purposes, nude paintings were of women because it
yeah,
was like beauty. And again, it comes back to the male gaze and the objectification thing. And that's just
of
super
course.
interesting because I
Yeah, no,
really
of
I
course.
struggle to paint men. I really do because I think
That's what I was going to ask you. That's the question I'm going to ask you in a minute.
so many people ask me this, and I really
Yeah,
do.
because I'm
I
curious. Okay, so I'll ask you now then, because probably now's the best time. So like, so have you painted men in the past, and or why don't you paint men? And what? And as you just said, if you struggle with it, why?
I've painted all genders, um, and non-binary people and everything, but I think I struggle to paint men because I think I struggle to feel like I have as much to say about the male body. So if I'm painting a woman or someone non-binary or trans person, I feel like their body is the subject of discussion without them wanting it to be. And so by me using an image of them to sort of make people aware of that discussion, that has more significance. Whereas I think painting men is, I don't think it has the same amount of interest in the same sense that I'm looking for. I don't think there's a discussion point around objectification and viewership of male bodies. So in terms of aesthetic, painting men, they come out fine, but I don't feel I don't feel accomplished in the paintings I have done of males because I don't feel they have the paintings that I create of them have as much to say, if that makes sense.
Yeah, of course.
But yeah, I think my point works well because of the male gaze. And so I think if I was painting men and it was obviously men, it wouldn't have that discussion point at all. It would be a different subject. I say that though, Celia Hampton did a fantastic, quite a long time ago now, I think actually, a great series of paintings where she went on like a chat roulette site, like the
Oh yeah,
thing,
yeah.
and basically anyone who came up who was naked, she'd ask if she could paint them, and she did like 5-minute paintings,
Oh
and
wow.
basically it's like a wall of penises, um, and the whole thing was about like this detachment and online and
Yeah.
sexualization, and it's absolutely fantastic. I mean, I love Celia Hampton anyway, but this particular thing, I looked at it when I was at uni, and I was just like, that's what I'm talking about. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I think the painted male nude is super interesting, but I think you have to have a deeper concept which doesn't relate so well to what I'm interested in.
Yeah, of course.
So yeah, so that's probably why well, I don't think I've ever like published any of my male
See,
paintings. They've
but that fascinates me because that shows me that you've thought about your work enough that you have some form of limitation as to where you're kind of comfortable with your skill and your thoughts and your opinions and your kind of ideas you want to express. And I think that's really, really interesting for me because at this moment in time with my own work, I'm thinking a lot about the ideals of masculinity and the ideals of what is the role of the male in society and how is that changing. And I think that's kind of something that I'm always curious about in terms of when I look at images, just in everyday life. Because you're right, obviously, male gaze is very prevalent everyday life, even for other men in terms of you have to be successful, you have to have, a lot of money, you have to have a Rolex, you have to have a car, you have to have a lot of women, all that kind of typical masculine traits. And I think that's super interesting that you're like, okay, well, I can understand it, I see it, but actually, that's not something I would like to discuss. I want to discuss what I'm interested in, what's going to be good for me, and what I can talk about. And I respect that a lot. I really do. And I actually really like the fact then that even though you have done it in the past, you're very much comfortable being like, you know what, actually, that's not for me to discuss. Because
Yeah, and
I think one of the things about art and artists is that you can just try and create stuff just to please people and be like, okay, this might get a few more views. Let's do that. Whereas you're like, you know what? No, this is what I'm interested in. And you want to be a bit more deeper within your own work.
yeah, and it's having the right authority to talk about it as well. It would be like if I was making work about racism, that would be really difficult for me to understand it because I'm white. So it's
Yeah.
the same with me being female and cisgendered. There would be no way of me painting men and discussing sort of like the male experience of objectification and viewership and stuff because I haven't experienced that and I can't experience
Yeah.
that. And so, like I say, in that same factor, the reason I paint how I do is due to my own lived experience. And I think that's important for artists, like you say. It's not only problematic, but sort of painful when you see people trying to like jump on the bandwagon of what's relevant. And you're like, but you can't talk about that because you
Yeah.
don't
I've seen a lot
know.
of that lately. So what I haven't asked you about, and I don't know why I didn't ask you about this, is the idea of the crop. So can you, yeah, please talk about the idea of the crop because that's what I mean. It's not the most fascinating thing about your work because your work's fascinating in general, but it's like another layer of ambiguity.
Interestingly, you said about another layer of ambiguity, and I think that's kind of exactly what it is. It's just like another method of removing the obviousness of the subject. When I first started doing the crop, it was sort of an experimental thing. I was looking at um, like digital decay and replication, and so I was looking at like blurred imagery and the idea of sort of zooming in to like really blur images. So it sort of initially came from that as sort of part of the process of abstraction, but then it became more relevant when I started working completely figuratively because it was, like say, again, another layer of which in which to use the obscuring or the not distortion of the image, but the abstraction of the image to make the subject more ambiguous. Um, and from there, it just became like a tool to use so that things aren't obvious in the image. Some of my pieces are like way more cropped than others, which I really like using the variation so that some pieces are like completely abstract and some are really clearly figurative, but not a full person. Um, so yeah, I think it's just it's in enhancing the ambiguity of the image as far as possible, but still keeping it recognizable.
Yeah, because I thought it was a really interesting concept, and I think particularly looking at your work, it definitely creates kind of a visual interest, and it makes it kind of like as you know, I guess I just said earlier, it makes a viewer work a little bit harder to be engaged with the work and kind of figure out what they're looking at and being a bit like, oh, where did this image come from, and what is this
Mm.
image? What is this image, and what are we looking at exactly? And I think it's a kind of revelation that your work brings that's really fascinating. Well, one of the fascinating elements of your work is that it's like a journey. Looking at it is you don't just look at it like, okay, that's a really nice, pretty image. It's like, what am I looking at? Okay, oh, okay, it becomes like a whole process, and I quite like that. I think that's really clever.
Thank
um
you. Yeah, I'm glad that sort of translates into viewing them. Um, because obviously when I'm creating them, there's so many different elements of the process where I see it right from like an initial image or initial subject that is obvious what and who they are through to a painting which is in some cases completely different. So I'm glad that translates in terms of like almost like unpacking the process of coming back to a body.
and how often do you actually show the process of your work?
Not very often really. I think now with the digital drawings and the embroideries and stuff and sort of branching out to different mediums, I'm probably showcasing more like traditionally figurative pieces. So I think then there's more of an element of understanding of the interest in the figure within my work. Um, but I think definitely the sort of the process of the work is quite, not that it's like private or secret or anything. It's just I don't feel that sharing it is like helpful to the viewership, because I think then again it's almost like telling people how they should view it.
Yeah, about to
So
say, yeah, yeah. So do you think it takes the magic of the work away? Takes away from the magic
yeah,
of the work?
a little bit. I think it's quite nice for people to almost like work it out by themselves. And once obviously, the more of my work you see, the more understanding you have of it. And especially like say my blog as well, I think it sort of describes, there's a few that do talk about process and stuff. And so I think once you have that understanding, it's helpful to sort of understand where I'm coming from the work. But I think in viewing them, nothing's added by knowing the process to the actual like visual of the piece. It's more interesting, almost like as an after the fact of seeing the work and going, oh, that's interesting, and then finding out about it and being like, oh, okay, like it makes even more sense.
Do you like looking at other artists' process?
Yes, but I think in very different ways. Like sometimes I'm really interested in the process in terms of like the practicalities. Like I love watching printmakers just because I'm so not good at it. So like I'm obsessed with watching people screen print and lino cut and stuff. um but I'm also really interested in people's process in terms of like especially artists that use appropriated imagery similar to myself. Like image collection is fascinating because I think some people literally have like warehouses full of magazines and newspaper clippings, whereas other people it's like all digital and found imagery online. So yeah, I think it's definitely interesting, but it's almost like, again, takes the magic away a little bit in some cases. I think it's like going into the kitchen in a restaurant and it's like, oh, this is all a bit weird. Like, yeah, so it's enjoyable, but it's definitely, I like to keep a lot of the sort of a little bit of intrigue, I think.
It's like stepping into somebody else's mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah.
So talking about like found imagery and this idea of collecting imagery, I think that's a really interesting way of working. Um, have you ever done like photo shoots for images, or do you just work purely off what you find?
I have very occasionally, um, but I do that more when I'm working to like a brief or for a commission, or yeah, it's like if I'm doing the photo shoots or if I'm creating the images, there's also images myself, that's usually for a set purpose. I prefer to work with completely found imagery. And I think there's more relevance to it being found imagery because of this whole notion of like looking and viewership and the availability of imagery. So yeah, I think in general it's quite important for it to be found imagery in terms of it having the same effect and also that level of detachment from me not creating the original image. Whereas if I've taken the original photograph, similarly to like we said about self-portraits, I've then got a relationship with the original photograph almost. Um, so yeah, I literally have like in my studio just like stacks of magazines and printouts, and I have like a whole folder on my phone of like thousands and thousands of screenshots of stuff I'm like, oh, that bit of that picture could be interesting, and then I've just like never gone back to it. So
Should go through
yeah,
it, should spend a day just going through it all.
sometimes I attempt it, and honestly, it's it's mind numbing. I'm such a hoarder of them.
But like that's a really interesting thing about your work, though, and that's the interesting thing about talking to you about your work because it's so cyclical. It's so, it's created from the internet, but it's also feeds back into the internet because you're posting it online, and it just has so much layer. And I know I said this last time, but it just has so much layer and depth to it, and it's interesting. It's not just okay. Here's a picture of a woman. Oh, but it's abstract, so you have to look at it and see what it is. And oh yeah, that's it. It's like so much more. And I think personally for me, so much art is lost online because you don't talk to people about the art. And sometimes artists don't want to talk about it. And it's like, but you're creating it. Surely you want to talk about it. Or at least, if you don't talk about your work, talk about kind of your thought process and your ideas and kind of like the inspiration from where it came from within you and your mind. I appreciate, obviously, we haven't finished, but I appreciate you taking the time to do this because it's super interesting for me. 'Cause it gives me a whole new definition and a whole new appreciation of your work in a completely different way that I wouldn't have got had I not spoke to you about it. Because I would have been like, okay, this is a really nice image. Let's feature it, and that's it. Um, but no, because I got to talk to you about it, it's like actually this is way more interesting, and in a way, it makes me feel more. connected with it and be like, you know what, actually, I want to support this further because I understand where it's coming from. It's not just, okay, let's just paint a nude to get likes. It's, oh, let's talk about a topic, you know? So I think that's really good. I actually think that's good. That's just a random tangent, but that's really cool.
Oh no, but it's great for me as well because like it's because my work is so based around like the viewer. It's so interesting to hear other people's like views on my work and how you came across it or what you think of it and stuff like that. So it's a two-way street. Like it's definitely like I love not just in a narcissistic way talking about my own work, but hearing what people think of it and how people sort of understand my work is really great for me as well because it sort of shows different levels that some things I might not have thought of that someone's like, oh, I really like this element of your work. And I'm like, oh my God, I didn't even realize that. But yeah, that's so important. So yeah, that's great.
Actually, it leads me greatly into a question that I was going to ask you later on, but I'll ask you now, which I feel like I say that every single time I say ask a question. So what kind of feedback do you value as an artist?
I think any feedback. I mean, if I think if you're making art that causes any sort of reaction, then you're doing something right. Like even if people are like, oh, I really like didn't enjoy that, then there's a reason why. I think the most important feedback is stuff that has like an explanation. Because if someone just says, oh, I don't like your work, obviously I'm gonna be like, oh, that sucks. But if I can be like, oh, but can I ask like why didn't you like it? And they say, oh, I find what did someone say to me once? I think it was at uni in a crit, and it wasn't at all like a criticism, but it was just saying like sometimes I wonder if your works are like too colourful for the subject that you're discussing, like they're almost too bright and happy and all this sort of stuff. And like we talked about earlier, the significance of colour. For me, I hadn't associated the colour with being like bright and bold and happy, but for them, they were like, yeah, they remind me of like posters or like kids adverts and stuff. And then the subject matter is so they were like it's almost like awkward and actually, I start to think that's quite interesting that it's
Yeah,
got
that is.
to it. Um, so I did some that were like really bright, like neon colors, but they didn't really work as well. But I was sort of then I started to play around a bit more with color. So I think there's no such thing as bad feedback as long as there's explanation. So like even if someone hates your work, as long as they know why they hate it, then that's constructive because you can be like, okay, well that's what I wanted. Like yeah, I wanted you to like the work because of that, but you hate it. But as long as you got that from the work, then it's good. Like it's having an effect. So yeah, I think especially for me, because the paintings I'm creating, I want people to not necessarily like I'm not trying to be like, oh, my paintings should make people like reevaluate everything and really think deeply. I'm not going to be that person. But I like the idea that people go, oh yeah, you're right. Like objectification is a thing. Yeah, that's interesting that you're discussing that. Like I'm not trying to change the world, but it's more about creating discussions and making people like aware of discussions that are happening. So I think as long as people sort of say, "Oh, like I really enjoyed the fact that I had to spend 10 minutes with your painting before I realized that it was a nude," that's great feedback. Like anything's good feedback as long as it's got reason. The feedback I hate is when people go, "Oh, it's really pretty," and you're like, "What? It's not supposed to be pretty. It's supposed to mean something."
See, that's actually quite funny because the last person I interviewed, this photographer, I feel like every single time I do an interview, I'm like, the last person I interviewed, the last person I interviewed was a photographer, and he said one of his kind of biggest worries is that people should look at his work and think it's a nice image. Like he doesn't want his work just to be nice; he wants it to
Yeah.
mean something. Because I think the problem is that's actually a question I should probably ask you, which I'll probably ask you in a minute anyway. But like, do you think like actually I'll ask you now. But like, do you think that the oversaturation of art, particularly with people who are content creators and who aren't doing it for a particular message within their work, do you think that impacts artists who are trying to have a message in their work?
Um, I think sometimes it can, but almost sometimes in a positive way, because as long as I'm gonna use an example here. So there's an influencer I follow called Grace Beverly who owns this like multi-million worth empire of like she started out as like a fitness influencer, and so she does like fitness wear, but she also does like sustainability and veganism, all this sort of stuff. Like super successful. She's like 20 or something ridiculous. Like super rich, super successful, awesome person. And the other day she did this painting in her house. She was like, I was just playing around with some paint, like something to do, like feeling creative. And so I did this painting. And she was like, I've had so many messages being like, oh, I love this painting. Would you make prints of it? Blah, blah, blah. And she was like, I'm not an artist. I'm not going to make money. She was like, she had a statue that she'd really liked, that she bought from an artist. And she'd based the figures in the painting off this statue. And she was like, so I'm not going to sell you my print. She's like, if you like this type of artwork, go and buy stuff from this artist.
Yeah,
And then she
that's
was like,
great.
I've even found some other artists who do stuff in a similar style or using similar colors. Here are their like tags and here are their websites. Like, go and buy from the artist. Don't buy from me. She's like, I'm not going to make a print of a painting that I made on a whim. And like, it was a really nice painting. Like, she obviously did well and she's obviously creative, but she was like, I'm not an artist though. So I'm not going to try and sell my art and make a profit from that. She was like, I'm going to send you to other artists. Which I thought was really good. And I think that's when it can be
Yeah,
positive, is that it's making people, it's like directing people to the right places. Obviously, in the world we live in, influencers have so much influence, funnily enough. And so there is this sort of, I think there's a responsibility with people who are massively connected to make sure they're not just like capitalizing on, not on other people, but on other ideas that aren't necessarily related. Like, obviously, she could have said, yeah, I'll make prints of these and sell them, and there'll be nothing wrong with that. But I think the fact that she did say, well, I'm not an artist, and actually I was inspired by this person, this was just for me, you should go and look at that, is credit to her. So
absolutely.
I think as long as it's difficult, because I think obviously it's so hard for emerging artists to gain this sort of following, this sort of reputation, without becoming like associated with a certain gallery, or like we said earlier, working with like marketing stuff as well. So it's difficult to make a name for yourself without relying on the sort of exposure. And so I think obviously, I don't know. I don't know, but I think people definitely, especially at the moment, I think there's definitely been like a move towards people doing like crafty stuff at home. And like I've
Absolutely,
seen
yeah.
a lot of people like making the like body shaped candles and stuff and all this sort of stuff, which I think is awesome, but also at the same time, I'm like, there are artists who have been making that sort of stuff for years.
Yeah.
And now it's like trendy. And then big companies are like, oh, here's a make your own kit, or here's some we've mass produced. And you're like, So it's difficult, I think, with anything. It's like, it's popularity and exposure. And I can't actually remember what the question was.
It's fun. Um, so how do you think people can tell a pretty image from an image that has meaning, or is there no distinction?
I think it's difficult because obviously there has to be some sort of initial thing that grabs you about an artwork. It's a bit like reading a book or dating, there has to be an initial attraction
Of
to
course.
that novel or that person. So I think in it's difficult to find new art that you like without it being purely aesthetic, at least to start with, unless you're being like recommended from someone. So like a lot of the people I follow on Instagram, and artists who I now really like admire even more, I initially followed because I was like, not, oh, that's a pretty image, but like, oh, I like that image. And then I actually read about them or like listened to them on a podcast, and I was like, oh my God, I like their work even more because it's actually about this. So I think they sort of go hand in hand, but you can probably distinguish just the pretty images from the ones that, when trying to delve further, there isn't anything more. Like you said, if my work was just, if you'd said, oh, well, why do you paint the figure? And I'd just gone, I like painting the figure, then my work wouldn't have much meaning. And so I think there's the distinction there is, a lot of the time people like art because of how it looks, but then they like art more because of its meaning. But obviously once you sort of know and understand an artist, like there are certain artists that literally they could bring something out tomorrow that was just like a blank canvas and I'd be like, it's amazing, just because I love the
Absolutely.
work and their
Yeah.
idea. So I think there's, like I say, there's an element of the two going hand in hand, but I think it's a lot to do with the artists themselves and how they can talk about their own work.
So at what point does an artist's reputation become the primary kind of source of their following, in terms of, as you just said, if somebody brings out a blank canvas and you're like, yeah, I love it, but then do you love it because you love the person, or do you love it because you love the art?
Very interesting. I think there's definitely a level of that, and I think it's hard to define at what point that happens in an artist's career, but it definitely does. Um, like there are artists that I love who have made work in the last like year or two that I haven't really liked, but I would never be like, I don't like that artist now. Like I still
Yeah.
like the artist. I just don't necessarily like the current collection. Um, and I think it's a bit of a status thing, definitely. But also, but yeah, I think it's difficult to like say pinpoint that sort of moment at which the name becomes more important. There's definitely like the upper level of that where you're in the Tate, like it doesn't matter if you literally produced a pile of newspaper in the corner, you've got an exhibition at the Tate, people are going to come see it. Simple as that. You know, like Damien Hirst could literally just pull down his pants in the middle of the street and people would pay millions of pounds for it. Like that's, you know, but that's when I think art becomes more about the brand and
Yeah.
like the idea rather than the physical stuff. Like Damien Hirst is a perfect example. His work is not necessarily like artistically what's what I'm looking for. You know, I mean, it's like Jeff Koons as well. He doesn't even
Jeff
make
Koons is
half
a
the
perfect example.
yeah, but this is the whole thing is it's not even about that work. It's about it being a Jeff Koons. It's about the wider concept of Jeff Koons. Like, so I think once you get to that level of like artistic fame, it doesn't even matter what you make or if you make anything at all. But I think before that, there's a level at which I don't know where it is. It's like I think it comes back to what we've just said about the sort of pretty image as well. I think if you have a concept behind your work that people can relate to and are interested in, as long as you can explain what work you're making, you have enough of a concept that the work, almost the work itself isn't so important. But then that itself is sort of that's contradictory in itself, I think. That's a really interesting question, a really hard question to answer. But I think there's definitely a point when you can say an artist is successful without the work they're creating being important. And maybe that's well, that sounded like really deep and I don't even know.
Okay. I think it's a really interesting consideration. It's a really interesting train of thought that I'm actually going to probably research a bit more actually now I'm thinking about it, because what I'm really, really interested in is commercialization and commodification of art. Like the way that, can anybody be an artist? Can you only be an artist if you do a certain thing? What makes somebody an artist? Are we born being artists? Are we born being creative? And I think there is definitely a really interesting idea that you create all this work and you put all this meaning into it, and then like say in 10 years time when you have amassed a huge following and a huge audience and people are paying for your work, that your work shifts from being this personal exploration of your mind to let's just make money, to and then it moves forward to what else can we make money on, and you become a business, because like artists are business, like being an artist is a business,
Oh yeah.
but then it gets to a certain point where it becomes an empire. And it's just like, if you're at Jeff Koons level, he's an empire. He's not a business anymore. He's not one person.
Yeah.
And I think for me, there's just a really interesting distinction between. I'm just really interested at the minute, and particularly in the minute, and the commercialization of art, and kind of like how do we feed into that, and how is it exploited? But like, do you actually think that art is in danger of being over commercialized?
I think everything's in danger of being over commercialized, to be honest. I think that's a really like socialist answer, but I think genuinely, like you just said, if people will pay for stuff, someone will sell it to them. And that comes down to everything. And I think especially in the sort of uncertain future we're in at the moment in terms of like job security and stuff. Like
Yeah,
if I'm not gonna lie, if someone turned around to me tomorrow and was like, "Hey, we want to give you like a £500,000 contract to make um I can't even think of like something I don't know something really generic, basic, like commercialized."
cartoons.
They're like, "But you can sign it, and we'll like give you loads of follow." I'd be like, "Hell yeah!" I'm not gonna lie because you
I
know,
respect that, but I
um,
think
but I'd probably feel a bit bad about it. But at the end of the day, I'm not in a financial situation where I could turn that down.
I about to say you'll
So
feel bad about it, but then when you look at your bank account, you'll be fine.
yeah, I'd be like, "Oh, I don't feel that bad about it." Be like,
But that's
yeah,
the thing. I feel like, obviously, I don't say this to you, but I'm going to say it anyway. But I feel like money ruins a lot of the joys of society, because
oh, yeah,
we become so like, oh, but it's about money. And because, and it, sadly, everything, almost everything becomes about money and the exchange, the idea of the exchange, which is what I really want to look at more. What actually are your thoughts and opinions on platforms such as Patreon and Kickstarter and artists using that to kind of boost their career?
I think they're really good and they're really helpful if people use them as like an optional thing. So I follow Sophie Hagen, who's a comedian on it's not a comedian on Instagram. She's a comedian and she's on Instagram. And she like makes awesome content. In the first lockdown, she did a load of like sort of Q&A style comedy shows on Instagram Live and all this sort of stuff. And she's written a book, but she gets like hardly any of the royalties because she's still starting out and all this sort of stuff. And she sort of said, like, if I made Patreon, would anyone support it? Like, obviously I'll still create content on here that's free, but like, would people be willing to pay a little bit of money for, say, just like a little extra stuff? Or like she was like, even like I could make postcards hilariously, or like stickers, and I could send them out to you if you wanted them, or like I could give you discount codes for upcoming like future shows when I can do actual stand up again. And people were like, yeah, totally. And so she did this thing where she's created an account and you can pay like, I think it's like £5 a month, £10 a month, or £15 a month. But however much you pay, you get the same content. And then
Yeah,
obviously she still does stuff for free on Instagram. So she was like, it's more about, if you want to support me, because obviously I can't gig at the moment, if you like my stuff and would like me to keep being able to be a comedian, if you can afford it, awesome. If you can't, you'll still get stuff, but just not quite as much as the people who are paying something. Which I thought was really good. And it was, really honest of her to be like, this is why I'm doing it. She's like, obviously I'm not making much money at the moment. So
of
if you're
course.
able
Yeah.
to support me, perfect. But yeah, I think the problem comes when people are like, oh, hey, like this image. Do you want to see more of it? And you're like, yeah, that'd be great. That'd be awesome. Oh, well, you have to sign up. You have to subscribe. You have to do this. Like you say, it's like the expectation of, it's like, yeah, you can't expect people to pay for everything. Just because you've created something. And Instagram as a platform in particular is about content creation. And it is a free platform. Obviously, we have ads, we have influence, we have all the other stuff, which make it a business and a corporation. But at the end of the day, it's a free platform. And so if Instagram started charging me, or like if individuals started charging me to look at their content, I wouldn't use it because that's not what
Yeah.
I see it as. Whereas if there was an artist, like there's a few artists I subscribe to stuff with, I'm not gonna be able to remember their names now, but they do like it's just a couple of times a year and it's literally like a fiver every time they do it. So it's like 15-20 pound a year, if that. And they release like a new selection of prints and you get like this super high quality PDF. And they're
Oh,
literally
wow.
like, and if you want to print from that PDF for yourself, you can. They were like, obviously it won't be signed and it will be like a printout. But like if you want to send that to a printer and get it printed and have it on your wall, you're welcome to. So
Oh,
you're like
wow.
paying for that service, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
No, I think it's totally fair. Like I said,
that's a
I've
great
signed
idea.
with them. Which yeah, it's great because then it's like it's not an original work. It doesn't really cost them anything, but you're getting something exclusive. So yeah, I don't disagree with the platforms, but I think there's definitely a problem with if everything online becomes paid, like subscription services or paid content, because that's part of the joy of it. Like I would never want my blog to be inaccessible because I made it payable. And also then you also really limit your audience for people who can and want to afford specific content. So yeah, I think they're good in practice in terms of when people use them for, like say, like Sophie Hagen, for example, she's done that really well. She's gone, everyone gets stuff, everyone gets awesome content. I'm gonna be funny, I'm gonna be online. But you might actually get like a little signed photo and maybe like a couple of extra jokes if you give me a bit of extra money and if you can. So and I think that's good because, at the end of the day, like you say, we're all running our lives because of money. Like we all need to eat and
Of course.
have a roof over
Well,
our
yeah,
head.
of course.
Yeah, so I don't think you can get mad at people for wanting to be paid, but yeah, I think there's definitely an element of greed when people are like, yeah, totally. I think there's a line, and I think some people are crossing it.
Like so the thing that frustrates me about this society is that people have an idea and they have a dream and they have like a passion, and it's like it's not just a passion if you're just trying to make money off it from the very start. Like
Mm.
it's like the flying fruit bar. Like, yeah, would I just be paid for it? I kind of don't really know, to be honest. Sometimes I think, yeah, I would. I'd love to quit my job tomorrow and just do this. That'd be so fun. But at the same time, would I really want to do that? Like, is that really what you want to do? Because that comes with a whole load of different kind of responsibilities and problems and ways of doing things. And I think
literally just about to say that.
Yeah, I think that's the problem is that even art's a perfect example. We just look at a famous artist and we're like, oh, so they're posting images on Instagram and they've got a lot of followers. That's such a good idea. And they're making a living off it. That's such a good idea. Let's do that. And then people think, okay, cool, that's it. I'm going to be an artist. I'm going to do that. But they don't think about the amount of years the person spent, the amount of time the person spent, the lifestyle the person has. Maybe they can afford to not have to work for a year and be able to just make art. Maybe, they don't have to they haven't got any kids, they haven't got commitments or something like that. I think we're very good at emulating what we see, like the tip of the iceberg that we see.
Mm.
Yet we don't delve any deeper and think, oh, actually, how does the person got to this point? And I think it's really weird. Like, I worry about the younger generation a lot because I feel like people just see stuff online and it's like it's not real. It's real, but it's not real.
Oh yeah, like the amount of people, not the like, there's not like it's loads, but I have had a few people. I keep saying that like I'm some sort of famous person.
Not yet, at least.
People come up to me in the street and say no, but like I've had a few people in my time be like, "Oh, you're so lucky that you get to do art full time," and I'm like, "What?" And they're like, "You're an actual artist." I'm like, "Yeah." And I have a job as well. Like, but yeah, but like, and I've done the same to other people I've seen on Instagram, been like, oh, I wish I could be like them and just do art full time. And then they're like, oh, sorry, I haven't posted in a while. It's been really busy at work. And I'm like, oh my God, they have a job too. And I was watching, or I was doing like a part of like this artist do like little writing tasks. And then every couple of weeks, we have like a meeting and a catch up. And sometimes we have
Wow.
guest speakers. And we had this guy whose name I've forgotten already. So it's going to be terrible. And he was a guest speaker a couple of weeks ago, and he writes for he's like an art critic for like the Londonist and a few other like quite big but not huge like London based papers and magazines and online journals and stuff. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so like, this guy's got an awesome career, it sounds incredible. I was like really excited to hear about how he'd like built his way up to that. He's got a full-time job working for an energy company. I had no clue. He was like, yeah, he's like, I get paid for what I do for like the art stuff, but not enough to live off. And it's so weird, isn't it, that you just assume that these
It's
people
like this
have like,
illusionary nature of art, and I think it's
yeah,
so fascinating because the amount of artists I talk to and the amount of artists that I'm in contact with, and they're like, oh yeah, they say the same thing. They're like, oh, I was busy with my job, and I'm like, oh, okay,
I know,
so it's not just me who's trying to run something outside of work. Like that's crazy,
yeah,
and I
it's
think
mad.
it puts so much pressure on people though as well to try to burn the candle at both ends, trying to do
Yeah,
two things at once, and it's like, you know, you have to find a balance. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not.
yeah,
You
because
know?
that's the thing. I think hustle culture has gone like so far that almost downtime is like not frowned upon, but there's like a
Yeah,
judgment.
but yeah,
Like I felt so bad the past like month or so. I haven't done much painting, but
that's
at
a
the same
good
time,
thing.
it is a good thing. But like at the same time, I have been doing other artwork. I also got a puppy, which I've been looking
I
forward to.
know.
I've moved into a new flat, so and we've been doing like a little bit of DIY around the flat and stuff. And I was working up until like 2 weeks ago, and then so basically I furloughed from my full time job. I was working a temp job in the first lockdown, and then I've left
Oh,
just to go back to my full time job. So and I was suddenly like, why? And I was looking at my Instagram, being like, oh my God, I haven't posted something, and like so, I was like, I haven't had time to make anything. Of course, I haven't posted anything. But you feel bad that I'm like, oh my God, the other night I had a takeaway and watched a film rather than writing a blog. Like you start to like
yeah.
question yourself. And that's the thing, I think it's gone so far where people were expected to literally be like constantly busy, and it's not healthy.
It's not, and I think actually, yeah, can we actually that's what I definitely want to talk about then. So can you talk a bit about like how do you balance working and being an artist?
Very chaotically. Yeah, I mean, I'm very lucky that I have worked in jobs where they've always been really supportive of me wanting to do art and pursuing that. So I currently work at a pub, and I've worked there. So I worked there throughout my university, throughout studying. I was working there part time, and then when I left, I was working there sort of not part time, but not full time, like sort of varied hours. While I was looking for other jobs, and like I say, they've been great. They knew I wanted to work in the arts. They were always like fine with me going for interviews for stuff. If I had an exhibition, I had to like go to London short notice to deliver some paintings. They were like, yeah, cool. So it's awesome. They're like super supportive. And then obviously the pandemic happened.
Yeah,
So I was furloughed. But I wasn't getting very good furlough pay because I had been part time. So there's a whole other issue. So then I got another job
yeah.
at one of the COVID testing centres. So I did that all last summer. And then obviously the pub reopened at the end of summer. So I went back to that. And then obviously we closed again after Christmas, so I went back to the test centre. And then now, so like I said, I've left the test centre again, and then obviously the pub's hopefully going to be reopening in a couple of weeks' time, so I'll be going back
Yeah.
there. And then I'm starting my master's in September, so I'll be leaving the pub again in like August. But yeah, so I've never not worked basically, because of needing to, you know. And like I say, I've been lucky where I've had good and supportive jobs that have allowed me to save up and take time where needed to work on art and stuff. But it's difficult because obviously for most people who are in the same situation, you graduate, you're either looking for work, you're going on to further training, or you're working a job that's not to do with your degree to live while trying to become a freelance artist. And those two things are not compatible. Like, you know, I get 2 days off, and especially with hospitality
Yeah.
work, a lot of the time I'm working shift work. So I might not get in till midnight, and then I have to be in at 9 a.m. the next day. There's no way I'm coming home and doing a painting. Like, that's not happening.
No.
So it's very much a juggling act. And it's very stop-starty. I've definitely had, you know, a month or two here or there where I haven't done anything creative because I haven't had a chance to. You know, and obviously on top of that, trying to have a social life, go to the
Yeah.
gym, see my family, not at the moment, obviously. You know, sleep.
Yeah. Have a life, you know.
Yeah. So I think with anything, like you're doing yourself, when you're working and doing something as a side project that you would like to do full time, potentially, you have to juggle it. But also, I think it makes you realize that you do actually want to do it
Yeah.
because you're making time for it.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, so it's totally madness and chaotic. And I'm always tired, but that's life.
See, I can share that sentiment a lot, and it's actually that's crazy though. Like, I think it's crazy in the first place that we all feel the need, or society puts the pressure on us to have to work so much and be so involved with money. And I think it's interesting for me because art seems to be very much anti that, or at least not. Okay, not anti that, but like I don't like this kind of notion that art seemed as, oh, lesser.
Mm,
The creative industry is no lesser or no less important than doctors and nurses. Sure, doctors, nurses, lawyers, sure, their purpose in society is different. Sure. But why, just because you create something, why does that mean that people shouldn't be paid for that? Or why does it mean that it's okay for us to disregard that? Like, I don't like
absolutely.
that.
No, I completely agree. Like you say, obviously we couldn't we couldn't live without doctors and nurses and stuff, but there wouldn't be much point living if there wasn't anything creative or anything interesting to do. Like, so, you know, yeah, on a very base level, we could all exist without art, but would you want to? Like, I mean, so yeah, I totally agree. It's disappointing that it's seen as well, I still get it. It's like it's not seen as a career. Like when I tell people that I'm doing a master's in contemporary art practice and I did my BA in fine art and I paint and I work part-time, they're like, oh, so what do you want to do? I'm like, I want to be an artist.
And they're like,
And
oh,
they're like, yeah, but for work. I'm like, yes, for work, correct. Yeah, that's it. No, that's not everybody. Obviously, there are some people like cool, but I understand the question because a lot of people do degrees and then they're like, oh, I want to lecture or I want to run a gallery and stuff, which obviously are awesome careers too. And I'd love to do stuff like that as well. But at the end of the day, I want to be an artist. And the fact because it's freelance, I think attitudes are changing because there's a lot more freelance work in all industries. But I think because the arts has always been like a sort of it's seen as like a separate industry, even though it's not. People assume that it's like a bubble, and so they don't see it as a proper career because they're like, "Oh, you're an artist." You're sort of like, literally, I still parts. Some members of my family are still like, "Oh, you're gonna like live in a squat and just like grow dreadlocks and wear tie dye," and I'm like, "What stereotype are you focusing on here? This is ridiculous." But yeah, so
see.
I mean, the struggling artist now is like I think more defined as working in either retail or hospitality, probably having multiple jobs. Um, but other than that, like pretty normal life. Like, yeah, I don't see it as like a different career to what any of my other friends are doing. It's just slightly less sort of directional, I think.
Yeah, that's actually a great way to put it. It is less directional because you don't quite know what you're going to be doing, in a
Yeah.
year's time, and you're not going to be stuck. But I think that's the one of the joys of it is that it's a lot. It's very much about play. It's about playing. It's about experimenting. It's about trying new things. Whereas in a regular 9 to 5 job doesn't allow you to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's much more like, I can do multiple things. Like if I love my job. I'm very lucky that I've got that. And I know if I wanted to, I could always work there, either part-time or full-time, and do art.
Hmm.
So like if I found something that I, love doing, was really great at and worked around my lifestyle, I could be like multiple things. I could be like an artist, and I could be like a personal trainer and a teacher, or like a lecturer, or like do dog walking and all this different stuff. And I could be like all these multiple things because it has that flexibility that it's not like a set thing. Whereas, my friends who are like teachers love their job. They've always wanted to do that. And they just literally came out of school and did what you need to do, become a teacher, and other teachers, and they're super successful. But they can only be teachers because obviously that's like a hugely vocational job where you have to dedicate your entire life to it because it's really intense. Whereas like being an artist, you can make it whatever you want it to be. If I wanted it to be super intense, I could make it that way. But I can also be like, okay, I'm gonna take 6 months off because no one's paying me. So
Yeah, no. That's a really good point, though. I've never thought about it in that way, but now you mention it, that's a really good point. And that leads me on to a very interesting question I was going to ask you is, what do you think the role of the artist is in this current society?
oh, I don't know whether to be practical or whether to be like a bit sort of philosophical about it.
Both is perfect.
I think if I'm thinking philosophically, I think artists are like that sort of reminder of why we are all doing different stuff. Because I think if there wasn't that sort of creative energy, we would all just be in the same job, working the same hours, eating the same food, living in identical 3D printed houses, being paid the same wage, watching the same TV shows. And that would be boring. And I think art is like the reminder that people have different tastes and different interests. Because like saying you don't like art is like saying you don't like music. Like you can not have an interest in art, but you're gonna like something you see. Like you're gonna, or even if it's not fine art, you're gonna see a poster that you like the design of. Like art appeals to something in everybody, and I think it's sort of the function of the artist to go, hey, like remember you're not a clone, you know. Um, that should be my tagline. Um, but yeah, so I think in a philosophical sense, art is like the a reminder and like an awareness of the unique nature of being a human, and being creative is that sort of like outlet for that. Because like I say, we would all technically, biologically speaking, survive without art and without creation and without like being creative beings. But would we be living? Would we just be like robots? So I think there's that sort of like that side of it. And I think the umbrella of art in that sense covers like music, literature,
Of course,
dance,
yes.
all that sort of stuff. In a more practical sense, I think art functions to like explore things in a way that I was going to say academia, but that's not the word. Like explore things in a way that logic can't necessarily explain. Like art sort of addresses things in a way that maybe reaches people in different ways. Like I could easily write an essay on my paintings without making a single painting, but it wouldn't have the same effect. So I think art functions to address issues in a more engaging way than just facts and words and numbers. Like it's the more sort of um what's it quali- quantitative and qualitative data. So it's like more qualitative data of how to engage with the world. I think, yeah, it's just sort of like unpacking existing in an interesting way, I guess.
Yeah, it's like creating a subconscious interest in something.
Yeah, totally. And yeah, just like appealing to the human side of people, let's say, is that, like I could read scripts from movies instead of watching the movie, but I wouldn't enjoy that as much. But some people would. So same with art, I think. Some people would like to read about painting, some people want to see it, some people want to listen to a piece of music someone directed after looking at the painting. It's like it's a whole new way of engaging with stuff.
Actually, that makes me think of a question that that's just a random question, but like, have you ever thought about turning your work more from paintings into experiences?
I have thought about it. I've never really actually experimented in it. I think we were talking about this a bit last time with the silhouette stuff I'm sort of working
Yes.
with. I have visions of rooms filled with sort of shapes that if you stand at certain angles, you can see what they are and different, all sort of sculptural stuff, but it's very much a pipe dream at the moment. So yeah, I definitely have thought about it, but also I think partly apprehensive in terms of whether or not I would be able to do it, and partly apprehensive as to whether that would remove some of the impact of what I'm discussing and sort of redirect that impact into the experience of the art itself. So yeah, I think it's going to be something I hopefully delve into a little bit further when I start my masters. But yeah, not really sure.
Okay, so how do you define the term contemporary art?
Oh, personally, I think I define contemporary art as art that is being created like now. So artists who are still making work are contemporary. Um, but I think there's is a difficult distinction because we sort of moved out of like the sort of isms, like we're not in modernism anymore, we're not really in postmodernism anymore, although there are postmodern artists, we're not in the era of postmodernism. And so we are just sort of like, I feel like for the last 20 to 30 years we have just sort of been in like contemporary times. um but I almost feel like we won't develop a terminology for current arts until like much later on, and then it will be like an afterthought. So yeah, I think for me, I define myself as a contemporary painter because I'm creating work currently, and I think I'm addressing contemporary issues like current social issues. So I think stuff that engages with or discusses like things that are happening now or things that are relevant now, is contemporary art. Whereas I would say potentially art that doesn't necessarily have like a deeper meaning, like if you were like say painting landscapes and it was just purely about the aesthetic, you like landscapes, good at painting landscapes, they look awesome, I would say you're more of like a nature or landscape painter than a contemporary painter. Whereas if you were like painting landscapes but it was about like gentrification and or like the environment or something like this, then I think that would be contemporary painting. So I think it comes down a lot to the sort of whether you're engaging with current topics within the art world and within the wider sort of social spectrum, or whether you're just painting for or creating art for the sake of creating art, comes into whether you're sort of engaging with the art world in inverted commas. um yeah, I guess that's sort of my definition. That's a difficult question to answer, like I say, because we haven't really got, like, we're not really in an art era at the moment, or well, we probably are but we don't know it.
Yeah. Well, no, I appreciate that. I think there's a question I thought of the other day, and I was like, because obviously we hear the term contemporary art all the time, but like as an artist working in this current time, I'm always like, well, how do people feel about that term? And what does
Mm,
that term even mean? Because one could argue Edward Hopper is still a contemporary artist, because his work is still very much rooted within contemporary society. And I've got a book of his over there. Like I love his work. It's like it inspires people today.
yeah, it's still
Um,
relevant, yeah.
so I think, yeah, that's just an interesting question I thought I'd ask. And not just that, I have the privilege to be able to ask people that who are actually working artists. So, you know, in any respect. So do you actually have a question you'd like me to ask the next artist I interview?
Oh yes, probably. I've probably got 1,000. Um. Oh, what do I want to ask? Um. Something about like when they decided to start calling themselves an artist.
Oh, okay, that's a good
But
question.
like when did they become an artist, and when were they like? Because all through uni I would call myself like an art student, and then one day my tutor was like, "You're not art students. You're artists who are students," and we were like, so and since then I've called myself an artist, even though I'm not being paid for it. So yeah, I
No,
think that's
that's a
interesting.
really good question, actually.
You have to start consider yourself as an artist.
I listened to a podcast, Artist Decoded, which I'll send to you, which I'll probably send to everybody, but I'll send to you as well because it's a good podcast I like to listen to. And in it, they had an interview with a sculptor called Brian Booth Craig. And one of the things he said was that a painting is not complete until the viewer sees it. What are your thoughts on this?
I like that. I really like that phrase. Yeah, I think because there's such an argument, isn't there, about whether a painting's ever finished. And I definitely feel like my paintings that are finished, I could totally work more on if I was required to or if I felt the need. So they're not really officially finished. But then yeah, I guess once someone's seen it, and especially once you can like associate it with something like we were talking earlier with titles, if someone turned around to me and said, "Oh, I really like your painting Bicycle," and I said, "Oh, actually, it's now called Bicycle 3 and I've painted over it and it looks different." I feel like there'd be a real like, yeah, but that painting still existed. It would still be a different painting. So yeah, I kind of agree with that. I've never thought of it like that. I think that's an awesome like way of knowing when a work's complete is when you show people and they go, "Oh yeah, so this is this piece."
Yeah, because something that really struck me, which is why I probably asked about 3 or 4 people this question now, because it's really interesting to think of, because I think it's so easy for you to create work and you create work and you create work. And obviously, people are going to see it, but you don't think about, so at what point, yeah, it's just an interesting thing to think about, I guess.
I really
It's so that, because when I heard it, I stopped and I was like, I need to write this guy's name down. So I was like, I need to reference it because it's so important and it's so interesting. And it's just a great question to ask people. In your opinion, what makes a good piece of art, and what was the last piece of media or image that captivated you and left an impression on you?
Oh, I think a good piece of art is something that it sounds a bit corny, but it's something you remember. Because I think we're so saturated with images that for something to really like stick in your mind and for you to think about after the fact. So like if I saw a really good painting in the gallery and then I was like walking home that afternoon, I was still thinking about the painting, I'd be like, wow, that was really good because it's really stuck with you. Um, and I think that can be for different reasons. Like it could be really like superbly technical and really well painted, or it could just be like have some sort of imagery that really connects with something inside you. So there's multiple things that can make something good, but I think the overriding factor is something that really, really sticks with you and like, yeah, just like holds on in your memory that you can always like back reference and see it in your head for like weeks after. That's got to be like a really good piece. In terms of a really good piece I saw recently, I'm trying to think. I might have to have a quick little scroll on my Instagram and see who I've recently been looking at. Who did something really cool the other day? That's who it is. Oh, what's his name? This guy who does like paints over photographs. What's his name? Here we go. Yeah, he's called Will Claridge. So I
Oh,
came across him.
I've interviewed him.
It's just you who suggested him to me.
Oh, was it? Oh, okay.
It might have been. I can't remember because he also there's another podcast person I listened to who I did was part of an auction with over summer last year, and I can't remember if it was them or if it was you that suggested them to me. But he did. Did you see the thing he posted earlier?
No, I
With
haven't. I have it on Instagram.
he did the one of Falmouth boats, and I saw it literally just before we came on this podcast, and I was like, "That's really cool." So I'm going to choose that one as my most recent, which is relevant.
That's so funny. That's so hilarious.
I
That's
can't
so
remember
funny.
if it was you or if it was this other guy, called Leo, who I don't know if you might be aware of, who does the Curating Conversation podcast.
No, but I'm going to check that out. Send me a link to that. I'll definitely check it out.
Because he's from Ipswich, where I'm from as well, and we sort of weirdly crossed paths. I can't remember where. And then his was the one, the Rafiki Gallery's home exhibition I was talking about that I did the self portraits for. That's that guy.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, but the reason I really like Will's work, it really reminds me of someone who I'm not going to be able to remember now, who paints over Polaroids, but does it in like in similar to mine, well not similar to mine, but like in the block colors, so they're like super stylized, and they do them over the tiny Polaroids, and then have like a whole wall of them.
Oh,
which also
wow.
reminds me of your postcard gallery idea, which is really cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess that's Will's Falmouth painting, but also I think recently I've been really super into like people painting over photos.
Yeah.
Which I've seen a lot of. I think it's like, I don't know, because I always think it's the whole idea of like tracing imagery is almost frowned upon, but I think tracing is awesome and painting over stuff is awesome. I think it's really cool.
Yeah, because it extends the narrative of the original image. I think that's what's interesting about it, particularly Will's work. Like, well, I had a whole conversation about it, so I'll send you a link to that, even though you probably won't listen to it right now, but I'll send you a link to it.
Yeah,
But
definitely do,
yeah,
definitely do. Oh, that's
I
so
swear.
funny. That would be such a nice. Do you want me to say it in like a more like natural
No,
way?
no, no, no. This is perfectly fine. Like literally, like the thing is that like right now is like I'm really happy with how conversational the interviews turned out, people. So okay, so the final question, which is the infamous question, is what are you currently working on at the moment, and where can people find more about you and your work?
So currently I am working mostly on embroidery pieces due to space restrictions, but also because I'm just a little bit obsessed with embroidery at the moment. But I did just actually yesterday it was, although this will be months later now. I sort of played around a little bit with some clay work last year, doing some
Oh,
little sculptures, and I did a few more yesterday. And although I don't think they're particularly like um conceptual or interesting in ideas, I just like making them. So I'm sort of playing around with a lot of stuff at the moment, but mostly embroideries and silhouette work is really sort of high on my list at the moment. So I think there'll be some more, I hopefully there'll be some bigger paintings coming soon that are a bit almost like more abstract than before, even if that's possible. So they're in the pipeline and you can find them. I am on Instagram, which is Felicity Paints. My website is felicitybeaumont.com. I'm floating around on Facebook somewhere. Just look for Felicity Beaumont. But yeah, in general, Instagram is where I will post my content mostly first. My website is updated semi-regularly, biannually. But yeah, so I'm about, or obviously you can find me on the Flying Fruit Bowl. So
oh yeah, there is that as well. Oh yeah, I
yeah,
forgot about
little
that.
plug
Of
for you.
course. That concludes the second and final part of my conversation with Felicity Beaumont. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions or comments about it, please send me an email via theflyingfruitbowl@gmail.com or via social media. The Flying Fruit Bowl audio interviews can now be found on a variety of sites such as Spotify, YouTube, Apple Music, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the platform, please consider subscribing on any of those or sharing this interview with friends and family. Also, don't forget to check out www.theflyingfruitbowl.co.uk for daily art inspiration, and if you're a creative, please get in touch for a chance to be featured or interviewed. Once again, thank you very much for listening, and until next time folks, please stay safe.